Worm world, the underground trick that explodes container growth. Most container gardeners are fighting the wrong battle. They think slow growth comes from lack of fertilizer, small pots, or weak seeds. But in reality, the real problem is that their containers are biologically dead zones, compact, isolated soil systems with almost no underground movement, no worm activity, no nutrient cycling, no structure rebuilding, just static soil that slowly degrades over time. That's why plants in containers often look fine at first, then stall. Roots hit a wall. Water stops behaving predictably. Nutrients don't circulate. They accumulate or wash out. And no matter how much you feed, the system never really improves. One of the first things I changed that helped fix this started outside the container entirely. I began managing organic waste properly using a sealed compost container like the Enloy countertop compost bucket with charcoal filters. It prevents kitchen scraps from turning into that oxygen-starved, acidic mess that can damage soil biology before it even enters your growing system. I'll leave the exact one I use in the description if you want to check it out. It's a small habit change, but it protects the microbial foundation that everything else depends on. Now here's where things get interesting. So, here's the thing. Containers usually fail not because they're missing nutrients, but because they lack worm systems. Most folks, treat containers like they're just a simplified version of soil. You add your potting mix, throw in some fertilizer, water it, and then just expect results. But out in nature, worms are doing a massive amount of hidden work. They aerate the soil, process organic matter, distribute nutrients, and even create these microchannels that roots love to follow. Without that worm world inside your container, everything just becomes slower and, honestly, a lot less efficient. I've actually tested this myself in multiple container setups. Same plants, same soil mix, same feeding schedule. Really tried to keep everything identical. The only difference was whether worm activity was present or, just simulated. The difference in growth rate was obvious within just a few weeks. The real underground trick isn't simply adding worms. It's about building the right conditions for them. A lot of gardeners assume you just add worms and poof, problem solved. But that's not how it works. Worms just don't survive in unstable environments. If the soil's too dry, too acidic, too hot, or it's being constantly disturbed, they'll just leave or, die off. What actually works is creating a layered environment where worms naturally thrive. That means keeping moisture stable, having organic matter at the right depth, and really minimizing disturbance. Once you get those conditions in place, worm activity sort of builds itself. So, let me tell you how I simulate a worm-rich environment in containers. In container systems, I don't rely on chance. Instead, I actively design the soil structure to mimic what worms would naturally create. At the bottom third of a container, I include a mixture of partially decomposed organic matter and aged compost. Not fresh waste, not raw material, but stabilized organic input. Then I layer standard potting soil above it, leaving a gradual transition zone instead of a sharp separation. This creates a gradient where moisture and nutrients move slowly upward and downward, just like in a natural soil profile. Worms, when introduced or naturally present, immediately respond to that structure. Now let's talk about why most container soil collapses over time. One of the biggest hidden problems in containers is compaction. Every time you water from above, fine particles slowly settle downward. Over time, the soil becomes dense, oxygen levels drop, and root growth slows. Without worms or biological activity to continuously restructure that soil, it becomes tighter and less functional every season. That's why many containers perform well in the first few months, then decline. In my setups, once worm activity was introduced or encouraged, that compaction cycle slowed dramatically. soil stayed lighter, drainage improved, roots expanded more freely. So the mistake that destroys worm activity in containers, well, the biggest one is actually over-fertilizing with synthetic inputs or, using inconsistent feeding patterns. High concentrations of salts can really drive worms away or disrupt the microbial balance. Another mistake people make is letting containers dry out completely and then flooding them. That cycle, honestly, creates stress conditions that worms just avoid. What works instead is steady, moderate moisture, consistent but not saturated. In practice, that means watering deeply but less frequently, then allowing only slight drying at the top layer. That kind of stability is what keeps underground life active. Let's talk about how worm activity changes plant growth from the inside out. When worms are active in a container, they don't just improve soil, they actually change plant behavior. Roots don't need to push through compacted zones anymore. Instead, they follow worm channels. Nutrients are distributed more evenly, so plants don't experience those sharp spikes and drops in feeding. Water moves more predictably through the soil profile too. In one of my tomato container trials, the difference was really clear. The worm-active container produced thicker stems, more consistent leaf development, and earlier flowering compared to the control. Same inputs, but a completely different underground system. Even without adding worms, you can definitely trigger worm behavior in soil. If worms aren't present, you can still replicate parts of their function. By introducing small amounts of organic material in controlled zones, like thin layers of compost about 5 to 8 centimeters below the surface, you create these feeding pockets. Microbes break this down, and in larger systems, worms naturally migrate toward it if conditions are right. That creates movement and structure even before full worm populations establish. It's not about forcing biology, it's about giving it something to respond to. Mulch actually plays a hidden role in worm systems. It's not just about moisture control. Mulch acts as a surface food source for all that underground life. In containers, even a thin mulch layer of about 2 to 4 centimeters really helps stabilize temperature and keeps that upper soil layer biologically active. As the mulch breaks down slowly, it feeds microbes, which in turn supports worm activity deeper down. Without mulch, the top layer dries out way too quickly and biological activity just becomes uneven. And honestly, that kind of imbalance affects everything below. There's a deeper principle behind what I call worm world gardening. The goal isn't just to add organisms, It's really about building an environment where biological systems can sustain themselves. Worms are just one part of a much larger network that includes microbes, fungi, and all those organic matter cycles. When that system is truly active, containers stop behaving like isolated pots and start acting more like living soil ecosystems. And honestly, that's where you get real growth acceleration. This approach also changes how you feed plants. Once worm systems are active, feeding just becomes more efficient. Instead of having to rely on frequent liquid fertilizers, nutrients are released gradually through biological breakdown. That really reduces the risk of overfeeding and nutrient lockout. In my own setups, this allowed me to cut down on external feeding frequency while still maintaining or even improving growth rates. So it's not about adding more, it's about improving delivery. So, why do most gardeners never see this effect? Well, it's usually because they never build stable underground systems in their containers. They treat containers as temporary setups instead of as living environments. But once you start thinking in terms of soil life, instead of just soil mix, everything changes. You stop resetting containers every season and actually start improving them over time. If you're serious about growing in containers, this is honestly the shift that matters most. And hey, subscribe if you want more real, tested methods like this, focused on results, not just theory. Here's what really changes when worm systems are active. Growth becomes way more consistent. Plants stop stalling in the middle of the season. Watering gets easier because the soil holds its structure better. Feeding is more efficient since nutrients are cycled, not just dumped in. And overall maintenance drops because the system stabilizes itself. That's the real advantage. Bringing it all together, Worm World isn't about just tossing in a handful of worms and hoping for the best. It's about designing containers that actually behave like living ecosystems. When structure, moisture, and organic inputs are aligned properly, underground life really takes over the heavy lifting. And once that happens, container gardening stops being a constant struggle and starts becoming a self-improving system. If you know someone who's always struggling with container plants that stall or underperform, go ahead and share this with them, because once you understand how to build a living worm system underground, you stop forcing growth and you start supporting it. And honestly, that's where explosive container growth actually comes from.